Section 2 of Chapter 11 is the prorations. We're going to get into the actual math that's going to really show up. And I will tell you, people tend to freak out about what we're going to see in Section 3 later, which is doing the whole idea of the closing statement. If I could say to you what you need to really work on and focus on for all of Chapter 11, it's this section 11.2. It is the proration section. Prorations are exceptionally important for real estate agents in the real world because almost everything, in fact, that closing statement that we looked at earlier, there were 2 items that were prorated on there between the buyer and the seller. There was the homeowners association dues and there was the property taxes. And the reason that we had to prorate both of those things was we're closing in the middle of September. None of those things are billed in the middle of September. They're billed annually, they're billed monthly. Does that make sense for everybody? And whenever you have some
billed to one specific person, actually any person at all.
That's the perfect statement. That's exactly right. They're not, nobody, you are not important enough for the county to send you a special tax bill. Oh, darling, you're closing on September 27th. Let us print you a bill for exactly the amount of time you're going to own that property. No. How about no? So I want you to think of all of these bills at closing like the rudest waiter you've ever had in your life. You ask them to split the check, and what's their answer?
No.
No, figure it out on your own. That's what Venmo's for. That's what you just got told. Because that's really all prorations are. Prorations, really, seriously, are just, you've been told we have this bill that needs to be split between these 2 parties. And that happens quite commonly with real estate closings, where you have the buyer who owes a certain share of the time period, and the seller owes the remaining share of the time period. And so what we want to take a look at is how we do that. Prorations can happen with either debits or credits. Now, we've mentioned those words before. We're going to talk much more in detail about debits and credits as we go through this, but prorations can either be money coming in or money going out. Think about property taxes. That's money going out, correct? That's a bill that needs to be paid. Except when you're closing in the middle of the year, how many parties need to handle payment of that bill? Is it just one, or do we need to have 2 parties making payment for that bill?
2 parties.
2, right? HOA dues, that's a bill that's being paid. It needs to be paid by these 2 parties collectively. But rent is money coming in. But do we also need to prorate rent? If rent is for the whole month and we're closing in the middle of the month, is it fair that one or the other gets the whole month of rent? Are we going to flip a coin? You get September's rent or you get September's rent? Or are we going to split September up and give each person their fair share of the rent?
Split that.
We're going to split it up, right? And so prorations happen basically on every closing to basically split things out so that they are fair. For your purposes, the 3 things that are most commonly prorated on a closing statement are going to be, and by the way, these are in decreasing order of likelihood. This one will be on every single closing statement. Every closing statement will have a property tax proration because every property has a property tax bill. You will never have a real estate closing in your entire career that does not have a proration for property taxes. That will always be there. Well, look at the second one. It says, if any, because not every property is subject to what? HOA dues. But if the property is subject to HOA dues, are we going to have to prorate those?
Yes.
So that one would be less likely. And then we get to the one down here, which is almost never. Let's talk about rent and prorating rent. The only time rent would be prorated because we're not prorating a lease here. That's not what we're doing. This is not a tenant situation. This is a property that's being sold where the fleas come with the dog. Who's in this property that's being sold?
Renters.
A tenant, a renter, and they are continuing to pay rent. They don't care that you're selling the property. They want to keep on doing their thing as a tenant. Does that make sense for everybody?
Yes.
And so we need to have a transition of when is the rent going to transition to the new owner as well. And so we might have to prorate that rent to make sure that the seller gets their fair share of the rent that's already been collected, and the buyer gets their fair share of the rent that's already been collected. But we would only do that one if the property that's being sold is tenant occupied with rent being paid. Does that make sense for everybody?
I'm with you.
Okay, so that one's pretty rare. It just doesn't happen nearly as often. Prorations happen on timelines. You'll see me draw timelines over and over and over when we do prorations. I think drawing yourself a timeline, when I say a timeline, it can be something as simple as this. That's a timeline. Just something visual to think of that you split up. So like when we say property tax bills are prorated annually, well, that means you're prorating from January 1 through December 30th. Does that make sense for everybody? And think of the day of closing as basically being a divider here, and the seller is always on the left of that divide and the buyer is always on the right, because before the day of closing, always the seller. Everybody with me on that?
Okay.
After the day of closing is always who?
The buyer.
The buyer. The only one day, and I know people put way too much emotional energy into this.
Do not make this harder than it is.
People focus it's 1 out of 360 days, folks. People love to ask me this, but do I give the day of closing to the buyer or the seller? Here's my answer. I really don't give a crap, because they're never going to be two answers that close on the test. But if you want to know the actual answer, it's the seller, folks. When we prorate things out, we assign the day of closing to the seller. Whether you think that's right or wrong, it really doesn't matter. But at the end of the day, if you do your proration, because here's what I want to be clear about. If the seller owns the property, let's just say the seller owns the property for 120 days before closing, and the buyer owns the property for 239 days after closing. Is this one right here between them really going to make that much of a difference in your final answer? I mean, really? I've seen people choose an answer on a test that's $400 off because they're like, I didn't know whether to give it to the buyer or seller. I'm like, well, that was an expensive damn day.
Right.
One day is never going. Do y'all see why you can de-stress about that? Right? Just don't let that stress enter your life. The day of closing is ultimately not going to be that big of a deal, because they're not going to give you two answers that are that close to each other. For our purposes, because it's the way it's supposed to be done, we're always going to give that day to the seller. So the seller owns every day before closing plus the day of closing. Does that make sense for everybody?
Mm-hmm.
Now, not everything is prorated on an annual basis. How about rent? Rent is usually paid what?
Monthly.
Monthly.
So if we were closing today, September 22nd, the proration from
How many
September
days would the seller get?
we would be from September 1 through September 30th on that proration, because rent is paid monthly, with our closing being right here on the 22nd. So how many days would the seller get there? If the closing's on the 22nd, we were prorating rent, how many days would the seller get?
22.
22 days.
Oh, seller.
And how many days would the buyer get?
8.
8. Magically, they have to add up to be what?
30.
30. There you go. Anytime you're doing a proration, they have to add up to be 30 days. Simple as that. Are you prorating a year or are you prorating a month? Can you handle that?
Yes.
Okay. It's just a matter of knowing what you're prorating as to whether you're prorating the month or the year. So we talk about on the next slide who owns the day of closing. That's always going to be the seller. Whether you're doing yearly, whether you're doing monthly, doesn't matter. The closing date's going to be assigned to the seller. They don't overlap. I cannot stress again, this is not anything like when you did interim interest in the finance section.
Absolutely.
Remember when you did interim interest in the finance section, you added that extra day of closing back to the buyer. Does everybody remember that?
Yes.
That's what I was just about to
That's what I
ask.
was just about to ask too.
Do not,
Seriously.
don't do that, because that interim interest is not a proration. That's why you do it that way. Interim interest is a charge just to one party. That's the buyer's bill and only the buyer's bill. When we're prorating, we're splitting a bill between both of them. So therefore, they don't overlap on any day. The buyer takes over on a certain day. And so the seller's going to go all the way up through the day of closing. The buyer doesn't take over until the day what?
After.
After closing. Does that make sense for everybody? That. So when you look at these prorations, there is no overlap on the day of closing because we are literally splitting the bill. That would be almost like two people going to lunch together and both of them paying for the appetizer because they both ate off the appetizer. I understand that both parties are going to participate in the day of closing, but for our purposes, for just our sanity, we're going to simply say seller's responsible for the day of closing. Does that make sense for everybody? Okay. And
Prorations.
so that's the way we're going to handle the proration, whether we're prorating a year or prorating a month. So what I've tried to do for you on the next few slides is give you a couple of visuals about what will work for a proper proration on a closing statement. Because number one, to understand, if you go back, I'm going to go back a slide and look, every proration involves not one side, but two. Does that make sense for everybody? There's always a buyer's side of a proration and a seller's side of a proration. Is everybody with me on that? So when we talk about putting it in the closing statement, we're not talking about making one entry in a closing statement. We're talking about making what? Two entries. We got to make an entry on the buyer's closing version of the closing statement and another entry on the seller's version of the closing statement. Does that make sense for everybody so far? Okay. Now,
Taj has a question. I'm sorry.
Oh, go
I
ahead.
was muted.
Go ahead, Taj.
I'm sorry. It was in regards to the slide previously. On this particular slide at the top where it says closing date for the seller and buyer, for this proration, what is the closing date? Is that the settlement date or the date that is actually the information
what's always the closing date? The date the documents are what?
Recorded. So for this particular, so the day that the document is recorded is actually the closing date as well.
Right, which is why we should, in a perfect world, have settlement and closing happen on the same what?
Day.
Same
But if
day.
it doesn't,
we got to go back and redo our math. If our math was done, I saw Patty nodding and like grimace, and that happens. Yep. If you don't get that deed recorded by that day, is all your math on that closing wrong?
Ooh.
Yes. Because now you got to go back and recalculate those prorations because the seller owes for another day, the buyer owes for one day less. All the math changes if you don't get the deed recorded that day.
You mean I gotta do my math all over again?
Again, and verify it again. That's exactly right.
I can't believe somebody doesn't have a computer program that just does that, you know?
Yeah, well, they do. We don't, unfortunately, exactly. Excel is your friend, by the way.
For purposes of testing.
Yes, exactly. So when we look at these prorations, you're going to see these visuals of this buyer and seller here. What I've tried to do is stay repetitive with the same pictures. Now, when we look at a buyer and a seller on a closing statement, let's talk about these debits and credits, because you can't really deal with prorations until you really have a firm grasp on the definition of these words. Each party is going to get its own accounting worksheet. You saw one earlier. Notice there was nothing about the buyer on that closing worksheet that we went through. It was all the seller's side, right? That doesn't mean the buyer's not going to get one. They're going to get a separate one for themselves. Everybody following me on that? Each party. The closing attorney has to make sure both of them are accurate at the same time. So we need to understand how one thing being put on one person's closing statement impacts that same thing being put on the other person's closing statement. Does that make sense for everybody? Because a lot of times if I put something on one, I've got to also reflect it on the other because it impacts both parties. Okay. Now, each person is going to have a column of debits and a column of credits. Credits are good for that person. That's money in their favor. Whether it's money that they paid, so they're getting credit for, like examples would be the due diligence fee. Do you think that would show up as a credit on a buyer's closing statement?
Yes.
Right, because they already paid it, right? How about their earnest money? What do you think that's going to show up on their closing statement? Debit or credit?
Credit.
Credit, right?
But whose would it not show up on?
Well, let's hold on. Let's hold off about
Sorry.
them for just a second. He loves closing statements. He's anxious.
Yeah.
So, but when we talk about the buyer's closing statement, even their loan, think about their loan for a second. Now, from the transaction standpoint, that's money that they're being handed. Otherwise, they wouldn't have enough money to complete the transaction. So the buyer's loan, do you think that's a credit to them or a debit to them? Are we taking that money from them, or is the lender giving it to them so that they have enough money to complete the transaction?
It's a credit.
It's a credit, right? So everything that shows up in that credit column is good for that buyer. Then they're going to have things in the debit columns, and they almost always have more of those than they do credits. What's the one big whopper of a debit that's going to show up on line number 1 for that buyer in our closing statement?
Purchase price.
The purchase price. That's a big, ugly number, debit, that looms on the buyer's side as a debit. But they might also have debits for origination fees and discount points. Does that make sense for all of those things there? So credits are good, debits are bad. Now, when you get on the seller side, that's still true. The seller doesn't want to see debits on their side. They want to see a bunch of what? Credits. They want to see credits. They want to see money they're getting credit for. They don't want to see money that they're debited for. So debt / debit mean the same thing. It's money you owe. So think about the seller side. The seller has to pay off their loan at closing. You think that's a credit or a debit?
A debit.
That's a debit.
That's a debit. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. Are we all feeling
That's
okay?
how I remember it, though.
It works. It's a great way to work. Are we all okay with those? Are we good with the terminology before we go forward? Because if you're sitting there with even the slightest hint of doubt about debits and credits, you might as well go outside, take a nap the rest of the day, because you'll never get prorations if you don't understand debit, credit just as terminology. So it really is your opportunity to speak up and let me know if you don't.
Okay. I have another way to remember the prorations. So when you're talking about prorations, you have debits and credits. Well, this might not actually make the most sense, but it kind of would. So a debit and a credit are two different things. So one of the parties pays the day of closing, one party pays after. I don't know. I thought it made sense in my head, but it doesn't.
Yeah,
So.
you might want to work on that one again.
But interest pays the same day of closing. So
you might want to work that one up again. So now, are we all good on the terminology? Everybody good with that? Because we want to make sure. So now, look at the visuals here. When we take an item, I don't care what the item is. It could be property taxes that needs to be prorated. It could be rent that needs to be prorated. It could be HOA dues that need to be prorated. Either of these is a bad proration. You can look at this without any math and know this proration was done incorrectly. What do you notice is true? Look at proration number 1 on the left. Both parties are being what?
debited.
Debited. No. Cannot happen. Will not happen. Folks, right there on the test, do you think you'll be able to eliminate some answer choices where it says debit the seller for this, debit the buyer for that?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
If you see debit, debit, you're going to say nope, nope,
Wrong. Okay.
wrong. Flip side, what if you see credit, credit?
It's wrong too.
No, no,
Wrong.
Nope,
No,
nope.
no.
no, no.
Where did the money come from? Did it
Exactly.
fall out of the sky?
It was
I mean-
an act of God.
On the left hand side, somebody's stealing the money because it's just disappearing. You're charging everybody and no money's going anywhere. On the right hand side, apparently it's just growing on trees, right? Just give it, just it's like Oprah. You get a credit and you get a credit, you get a credit. No, it doesn't work that way. Doesn't work that way. What do y'all think does make sense?
Debit and credit.
Debit and
Mhm.
credit.
Mhm.
If we debit the seller, we credit the buyer for that same item. Does that make sense for everybody?
Mhm.
So
Yes.
property taxes on the closing statements. If you look at the buyer's closing statement and you see a debit for property taxes, you had better see a credit for property taxes on the seller's closing statement. Does that statement make sense for everybody now?
Mhm.
If you're looking at rent and you see a debit on the seller's side of the closing statement for rent, you had better see a credit on the buyer's closing statement for rent. Anytime you see items that appear on both statements, they have to offset each other. Now, these are not always tied together. There will be items that don't appear on both statements, like the buyer's discount points. Do you think anything about the buyer's discount points is going to show up on the seller side of most closing statements?
No.
No, that's the
No.
buyer.
But there will be monies that need to show up on both sides. And when they do, they have to offset each other. Here's the most classic debit credit. The sales price. The sales price is going to show up as a credit on whose version of the closing statement?
Seller.
Seller.
Seller, credit seller, which means if the sales price also shows up on the buyer's side, it must be what?
Debit.
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 Debit buyer. Does that make sense for everybody?
Uh-huh.
Mhm.
So anytime you're doing one of these prorations, here's what I tell you for test taking purposes, folks. Immediately, before you do any math, find any answers that say debit, debit, credit, credit, and do what with them?
Scratch them.
No.
Eliminate.
Nope.
Don't, not possible. Wouldn't it be great if 2 of those were like that?
Uh-huh.
And it
Yes.
often will be that way. You can often eliminate 2 of them because they got it all wrong. No, I know that doesn't work. Is everybody good are we good so far?
And Travis has a really
Travis?
good way. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Go
Oh,
ahead.
sorry. So basically,
fine.
essentially, it's like looking at your bank statements. Say if you go to Walmart and you buy juice for $2.50, Walmart's going to gain the $2.50. You're going to lose $2.50. It's not like it's going to be like Walmart's going to lose $2.50 just because you bought that juice for $2.50 and
exactly
you
right.
also lose $2.50.
That's exactly right. Here's the only substantial difference there, Amy, and you're right on it. Nobody ever sees both sides of that transaction. Nobody is looking at both Walmart's bank statement at the same time and your bank statement. If you could step back,
True.
if you could step back and see both of them, you would see the debit and the credit, right? If you could step back and see both statements at the same time, you would see a debit from Amy's account for $2.50 and a credit to Walmart's account for $2.50. Does that make sense for everybody?
Mm-hmm.
Well,
Yeah,
see,
really
with the
good
real
example.
estate transaction, we can see both sides. And that's why these debits and credits offset each other when they're on both sides. Is everybody good with that?
Mm-hmm.
But now, to stick with, because I love this analogy, Amy, I'm going to use it. I'm going to steal it from you now. Okay, it's the most sincere form of flattery if I steal it from you. If you stick with that analogy, is the buyer of the orange juice going to have some bank fees that get charged as a debit to their account that never impact Walmart? So later in the month, the buyer gets charged $10 by Bank of America for an account maintenance fee. Is that also going to be a debit on their bank statement?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
But does that $10 have anything on Walmart's bank statement?
No,
Nope.
No.
No. So what you need to understand is not everything is going to match up on these two statements, because I think you can go too far in your head and think, oh, if that's on the buyer side, it must also be on the seller side. That's not true. There are going to be some things that are only on one person's closing statement. Does that make sense for everybody? But
Yeah,
then,
and just to kind of like drive it home a little bit further, Travis, and you're going to mention this a little bit later, but I think it probably would be good to mention right now. If you are getting stuck on one of these, put yourself in the shoes of one of these people. You don't want to get screwed, and you really, if you're kind, you don't want to screw the other person. So kind of makes sense. Like if you're thinking, all right, if this person's giving me this, I need to be obviously receiving it, then giving it away to you.
you
or
need to
something
be
like that.
fair. And that's what prorations are meant to do. You're exactly right. Prorations are meant to make the thing fair. And the only way we can make the thing fair is by taking money from one person and giving it to the other. Think about when you split the tab at lunch. And I know none of us ever have cash anymore, right?
With cash.
But imagine if you went to lunch with a friend and they put the whole bill on their credit card and you gave them cash. We've probably all done that at some point in our life, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, you think about that from the standpoint of if you were doing a closing statement for that lunch, wouldn't you debit the person who's paying for the whole meal for because they're paying out for the whole meal, wouldn't you?
Mm-hmm.
yeah,
Right? But then you would only debit the person who's giving up cash, you would only debit them for the cash that they're handing over to the other person, correct?
yeah.
Correct.
But what would you do with the cash that you took from one as a debit? You would credit it to the other one.
To the other
So
one.
one person's only going to have one entry on their closing statement. The person who's paying cash has one debit on their closing statement. Does that make sense for everybody?
Mhm.
Yes.
The person who's paying for lunch has two entries on their closing statement. They have a debit for the whole bill, and then they have a credit
For half.
portion that they're getting from the other person. Does that make sense for everybody?
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what this idea of prorating at closing is all about. It's about making it fair overall. Is everybody with me on that?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So here is another great test taking tool to make sure you are doing this correctly. Okay. The debits and credits that you use on a proration. Now, I don't mean the overall debits and credits for the buyer and seller on the whole worksheet, but I mean within a single proration. If you're doing a property tax proration, if you debit $100 from the buyer, you credit $100 to the seller. If you're doing a rent proration and you debit $600 from the seller, you don't need to do any math for the buyer side. You credit the buyer with $600. Does that make sense for everybody? In other words, when you do a proration, you're going to make two entries, but the number is going to be exactly the what?
Same.
Same.
The only thing that's going to change is the word behind that number. If it's $600 debit seller, it's also $600 what? Credit buyer. Does that make sense for everybody?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, so I don't have to do any math at all. If I see this on my closing statement, if I see this, $650 debit buyer, what should I see on the other person's closing statement?
$650 credit.
$650 credit who?
The seller.
Seller.
So does that make sense for everybody? That's the only way it
Yes.
works. That's the only way it works, because what we're doing is taking one portion of that bill from one person and giving it to the other person. Is everybody with me on that?
Mm-hmm.
Because if you get this in your brain in little tiny building blocks, you really will be able to understand how to do the math of it. I promise. It's more of a thought process than it is a math process to do prorations. How are we so far? Are we okay?
Yep.
Okay, good. Good. So now this is not how a textbook would explain to you to do prorations. I've never yet seen a textbook that says find who's getting screwed over, but it works for me. I think it's the smartest way to approach a proration. you basically look at the situation and you say, now, wait a minute, that's not right. This person's getting screwed. Because no matter what bill you're talking about, either the buyer's getting screwed or the seller's getting screwed. One of the two of them with every bill, that's happening. Our job with the proration is to fix that. Our job is to offset the screwing over. We're going to do the opposite of what life has done to this person. We're there to fix it. We are the knight in shining armor riding in to go, wait a minute, this is not fair. We're going to make it fair. Does that make sense for everybody?
Yep.
So here's what it says here. Figure out which of the two parties is getting unfair treatment before or after closing for that item. That party needs to get credit at closing. Look at the example. It says, a seller who's already paid all the property taxes for the year in full in advance of closing has paid for too much time. Can we all agree that that statement's correct? If the seller paid for the whole year, have they paid for too much?
Yes.
Yes.
That ain't right, is it?
Mm-mm.
That's unfair. Unfair
Right.
to who?
The seller.
The seller.
Unfair to
seller.
the seller. And if the seller's getting unfair treatment, we need to give them credit
Credit.
for their unfair treatment. Which, by the way, if you're keeping score, you just figured out how the money's flowing. Because if we're crediting the seller, we are doing what?
Debiting the
Debit
buyer.
Debiting the
Debiting the
buyer.
buyer.
See how easy that just became when you do it that way?
Mhm.
It's the most simple thing in the world. Watch how fast you're going to be able to do this. Watch me work how fast it is. PT is selling a property to Howard.
Mm-hmm.
The property is tenant occupied. We're closing today. Everybody good so far? So TT's
Yes.
the current owner, Howard's the buyer. Property is tenant occupied, closing today. Tenant has paid the rent in full for the month of September to TT prior to closing.
Mm-hmm.
Now, who's getting screwed? If we don't do anything, if we just leave that like it is, TT got the whole month's rent, who's getting screwed?
Buyer.
Buyer.
The buyer. Then give
He
them
owns
a
the house for
what?
8 days. He
Then
owns
give-
the house. Mhm.
Give the buyer a what?
A credit.
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 What's the proration, folks?
8 days.
8 days
But
for
I
the
mean,
rent.
what, give me the debits and credits. That's all I want.
Okay,
Oh.
credit.
Debit
Oh.
seller, credit buyer.
Debit seller, credit buyer.
Credit buyer, yes.
Does everybody see where that came from?
Yes.
Mhm.
Yep.
Debit seller, credit buyer. Rachel is purchasing a property. Property taxes have not been paid. Rachel is purchasing a property. Property taxes have not been paid for the year. Rachel is going to have to pay them after closing in full. I want to know just the debits and credits. Think to yourself, who's getting screwed, and fix it.
Buyer is going to screw.
Credit the buyer, debit the seller.
Mhm.
Bingo. Credit buyer, debit seller.
The seller.
Because if Rachel buys the property and she has to pay the whole tax bill, that ain't right. So she needs to get a what?
Credit.
Credit.
A credit. And if we give her a credit, we got to give a debit to the other side. Does that make sense for everybody?
And the seller has to pay for the time they own the property.
Well, and that's exactly what we're going to head to. We're going to get to the time, but we want to make sure debits versus credit. So look at this one. Thomas is selling his home to Sheila, and the closing is scheduled for September 30th of 2022. Thomas has not yet paid the property tax bill for the year, and the bill will be paid in full by Sheila at some point after closing. Who's being treated unfair above?
Sheila.
Sheila.
Sheila. Well, if Sheila is being treated unfairly, not Sheila is being treated unfairly, then credit who?
Sheila.
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 Sheila. Does that make sense for everybody?
Mhm.
Mm-hmm.
And if Sheila is receiving a credit, and I know this is stupid, but trust me, it will help you get in there so you get them right. If Sheila's getting a credit, then what?
Thomas gets
Thomas should
debited.
get a-
Then Thomas should get a debit in the equal amount. Talk to me. Does that make sense for you?
Yes.
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 Okay? I want you to take 30 seconds. I just really want to know the bottom line answer. You can use the lines if you want to, but I just really want to know the bottom line answer. We're going to do 2 or 3 of them. How many agree with that?
Yep.
Correct.
Credit Betty, debit Tia. How do we feel about that? I'm telling you, this is 90% of the battle of doing prorations, is just getting the money headed in the right direction. Okay?
If
Look
you
at
can
this.
pick this out, you're 50%, 90%.
You really are. I'm telling you, this is 90% of the work with prorations on the test.
Yep.
Okay? Take a look at this one.
It's something everybody should get right.
Everybody agree credit the seller, debit the buyer?
Yes.
Seller's getting a credit, buyer should get a debit. Okay, look at this one. Tanya is selling her rental property on February 10th with buyer Bill purchasing what will be his first investment property. The tenant will remain in the property and has paid rent for the month of February in advance of the closing. Okay, so let's talk about this one. Who is being treated unfairly above? Is it Tanya or Bill buyer that's being treated?
Bill.
Bill.
Bill buyer is being treated unfairly above. Okay, which means Bill is
Would
going
be
to get
credit.
a
Credit
credit.
Bill.
Credit.
That makes sense for everybody?
Mhm.
Okay, and if Bill, the buyer, is getting a credit, that means
Seller get a debit.
Tanya, the seller, is getting the debit. Everybody follow on that one?
Mhm.
If we don't do this proration, Bill's gonna get the whole bill. I'm just being dumb.
Bill gets the credit, Tanya gets the debit. All right. Seth is selling his home at 148 Oakmont Drive in Graham to buyer Benny. The closing is scheduled to take place on April 10th of 2022. Seth has not received nor paid the annual property tax bill for the year. Thus, it will fall to Benny to pay the taxes in full when billed. Which party should receive a debit for property taxes on the closing statement, and which party should receive a credit for property taxes on the closing statement? Read it carefully. Make your choice. How many got that right? Debit Seth, credit Benny.
Yep.
Is there anybody not getting those? Is there anybody, because they should start to become pretty, are you noticing it becomes pretty automatic as you read through it now? You're like, whoa, 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 I can just see it. You start to lock it in pretty quickly?
That whole screwed over thing, it definitely helps.
Yes.
It does. It helps me. I mean, think about it. Somebody's getting screwed over here, and I need to fix that. To me, that's the best way to think of a proration. Okay. Tyler asked a question about the slide before, so I'm gonna back up. It said in the slide before, can I explain why he's being treated unfairly? But you got the right answer, but you're a little confused. And I'm glad you spoke up. It says Tanya is selling her rental property on February 10th with buyer Bill purchasing what will be his first investment property. The tenant will remain in the property and has paid rent for the month of February in advance of the closing. Right there, that's why Bill's being treated unfairly. The tenant paid rent in full to their landlord. Who was their landlord at the beginning of the month? Seller or buyer? Y'all help me out.
The seller.
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 So who was the rent paid to in full?
Seller.
Seller.
Seller. And that's why the buyer's getting screwed over in that deal, because the buyer's going to end up owning this property from February 11th through February 30th, which I know sounds weird, but it's just the way we do it in this class. But the buyer's going to end up owning that property for the 10th through the 30th and get no rent for it if we don't fix that. And the seller is going to end up getting paid rent for a bunch of days when they didn't even own the property because they collected the full month. It's not like the seller went to the tenant and said, now I'm selling the property on the 10th, so only give me 10 days of rent and hold on to the rest of your rent until the new owner pops up. The seller collected all the rent.
Mhm.
Does that help you, Tyler? I want to make sure we got your question answered there. Okay. Yes, no, maybe.
Probably. Okay, good.
Okay, there we go. That was a very long 3 letters, Tyler. Like, seriously.
Very suspicious.
I thought you were typing like a novel there. Yeah, okay, you're trying to fix your mic. That works. Okay. I thought it was gonna be like some big long paragraph. Yes. All right, last one here. Zelda owns an apartment complex located in downtown Durham and has contracted to sell the complex to Bosco with the settlement scheduled for March 10th. Based on this information, how should the debit credit for property taxation be handled on the closing disclosure statement? Last one. And I know we've beat it to death, but it is super important to get this right. This one, by the way, requires you to apply other knowledge you have from other areas of the course. Because they didn't tell you who's getting screwed over, but you should know it based on what you know. There are some things they shouldn't have to tell you. It should be very obvious when you understand how property taxes work and when they are billed. I don't see anybody jumping out there yet with an answer. Let's see.
When are the property taxes amounts released, y'all?
September.
They're billed in
September.
September. Are they paid?
Nope.
No, they're not billed yet. There's no way they're paid. Who's going to end up paying them?
Bosco.
Bosco.
Bosco's going to end up paying them. So who's getting screwed over? Bosco, right?
Awesome.
So debit who?
Credit,
Zelda.
debit the seller.
Debit Zelda.
Debit seller and credit to buyer.
Credit Bosco.
Debit the seller from January to March and credit the
Yeah.
buyer from March till the end of the year,
No,
went off
end of the month.
no, to March 10th.
You got whatever you debit Zelda, you've got to credit Bosco the exact
Same amount.
thing.
No, not the same amount.
Oh,
Same
that's a
amount,
really
Yeah,
good
because he's going to pay
point.
them at the end of the year.
same period of time, same everything. Whatever you debit one, you credit the other.
Because Bosco is already gonna pay the whole bill, and if we credit him Zelda's portion, he's already paying his portion.
There you go.
Right.
Right. The debits and credits have to match up exactly. So if you think we should debit Zelda for January through March, which I agree with, by the way, then we should credit Bosco for January through March, because it's got to be the same exact number. And by the way, they're going to put that in words on the test. So you've got to know that it's the same time period. You would not be debiting Zelda for her time and crediting Bosco for his time. If you debit Zelda for her time, what do you credit to Bosco? You credit
Zelda's
Bosco
time.
Zelda's time.
Zelda's time.
'Cause it's
And
gotta
I think this is probably the thing that these test makers actually know, that this is what these test makers prey on, because they know that you are focused on who is owing what portions.
Yes, they do.
So
They really do. They really do. Okay. So the most common
So,
proration.
Travis, is that why you always figure out what the seller owes first?
Yeah, because I think the seller's portion is much easier to figure out. It's
Okay.
easier to count from January through the day of closing than it is to try to start at the day of closing and go to the end of the year. I mean, to me, like if I was trying to prorate even a closing today, I recognize the buyer as the short portion of the year, but what's easier? Going from January 1st to September 22nd, where you know it's January, February, March, April, May, June, or trying to pick up and go, okay, September 23rd, how many days is that left in September? And then October, November, December. You see what I'm saying? For me, the buyer side is just way more convoluted to prorate. Here's the thing, aren't they splitting the bill?
Yes.
If I come
Yeah.
up with the seller side, isn't the buyer side just the remainder?
Yeah, that's what I thought. Yeah, that's what you showed one other time. I don't know if I was watching a video or what.
Yeah, and so I think it's easier to prorate the seller side and then come up with the buyer side and then decide which one of them you need. You know, that's what I would do. That's the way I would handle it. But you can do it. You can do it either way. All right. So the most common proration for sure is going to be property taxes. In North Carolina, the bill for property taxes covers January 1 through December 30th. Because the bills are not available till September, it is most common that the property taxes are unpaid at the time of closing. That is by far the most common outcome, that the taxes are unpaid. What that means is most commonly, who's going to have to pay the tax bill? If they're not paid as of the day of closing, that only leaves one other person who's going to own the property who's going to have to pay them. Who's that going to be?
Buyer.
Buyer. And if the buyer is getting stuck with the whole bill, does it make sense to say that the buyer is the one getting screwed?
Yep.
Yes. So that means we need to credit the buyer, debit the seller, most commonly on those prorations. But you always going to have a property tax proration on all of these things, and always go back to that who's getting screwed over here. You know, if the taxes have already been paid before closing, you're going to credit the seller, debit the buyer. If the taxes have not yet been paid before closing and the buyer has to pay them all later, then it's going to be credit the buyer, debit the seller. Everybody okay with those two statements there now, based on what we've done so far?
Yep.
Okay, good. So now is the next part of the proration. It says here, once you've decided who gets the credit, then we have to decide which half of the period of time do we want. Do we want the seller's half or portion? I shouldn't say half. Do we want the seller's portion or do we want the buyer's portion? Which basically means, do we want the time before closing or do we want the time after closing? And that's going to be a case-by-case scenario. There is no one answer always works here. Sometimes we're going to want the seller's portion. Sometimes we're going to want the buyer's portion. Is everybody okay with that? So in my experience, the best way again is to think about this whole idea somebody's getting bad treatment here. Look at the red statement there. It says if the seller paid a bill for time they didn't own, they should get credit for the time that they shouldn't have been paying for. Does that make sense for everybody? They should get credit for the time that if the property was not theirs. If you pay for the whole year's property taxes, you should get credit. Well, you shouldn't get credit for while you own the property. You should get credit for the time you didn't own the property. Does that make sense for everybody?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Everybody with me on that statement?
Yes.
Okay.
Mhm.
So look at because the problem here is that the seller was charged for the time that the buyer owns the property. We need to fix that problem. Is everybody good with me on that?
Yep.
Okay. And then the blue statement, it says if the buyer is going to be expected to pay a bill for time they didn't own, they should get credit for the time the property was not theirs. In other words, if the buyer is going to pay the whole bill, they should get credit for the seller's part of the year. Does that make sense for everybody?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yep.
Okay.
Yes.
That's because the bill was not theirs to be paid in full. They should not be paying for time they don't own. They've been charged too much money, so the seller needs to reimburse them for the time that the seller owned the property. Is everybody good with those two statements there?
Yes.
So now is where we come to the point of putting it all together. And by the way, these are the exact same examples we just went through. They have been repeated, but now what we have done is in addition to the debits and credits, we're going to add the time period to piece. Is everybody with me on that? Okay. So let's look at this first one. Thomas is selling his home to Sheila, and the closing is scheduled for September 30th, 2022. Thomas has not yet paid the property tax bill for the year, and the bill will be paid in full by Sheila at some point after closing. So who's getting screwed here?
Sheila.
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 Okay.
Buyer.
So Sheila's getting the credit, right?
Yes.
Right.
Okay. Which means Thomas is getting the
Debit.
right. Everybody agree with that?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yes.
We are crediting Sheila, debiting Thomas. Is everybody good with that?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So the problem is who paid for too much time?
Sheila.
Sheila. The time she paid for that is unfair is from when to when. When does she pay for that's unfair? I don't care about what she paid for that she actually owed. I care about what she's going to pay for that's not fair to her. What date?
January
January 1st.
September.
1st through
September 30th.
September 30th.
Haven't done your.
Does that make sense for everybody?
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
The
Yes.
time period that was unfair, the screwing over, was from January 1st through September 30th. That's the time period we care about on the closing statement because we want to fix the screwing over. So we are going to debit who?
The seller.
Thomas. Everybody with me on
Credit.
that?
Mm-hmm.
For the time period from January 1 through September 30th.
Mm-hmm.
And credit Sheila for, notice what that says.
The same period of
The
time.
same period of time.
Period of time, which equates to the same number. Does that make sense for everybody now?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Okay. So let's look at the next one then. Betty is selling her home to Tia with the closing schedule for December 12th, 2021. Betty has paid the property tax in full prior to closing. So let's just talk about who are we crediting and who are we debiting here? I think we can skip to that part. Who are we crediting here?
To the
Betty.
seller. Betty.
Betty or Tia? Who are we crediting?
Betty.
Betty.
But she already paid.
Because she paid the whole bill, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which means we just debit who?
The
Tia.
Tia.
buyer.
Everybody good with that?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So the problem is that Betty paid for too much time, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, it says Betty is selling her home to Tia with the closing schedule for December 12th. Betty paid for the whole year. So what period of time is the problem here? Don't worry about the period of time that was right. It was right, as far as I can tell, that Betty should pay for January 1 through December 12th. Does everybody agree with that?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
She owned the
Yep.
property during that time, so it was right that she should pay for that time. Everybody good with that statement?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
But we need to deal with the period of time that's the problem, right?
Mhm.
The problem is from December what?
First, December 12 to
Not the 12th,
December 13th.
13th through the 30th.
13. Yeah, it goes to
through
13.
December
30.
30th.
30.
So we are going to debit who?
Tia.
Debit
Betty. Tia.
Debit Tia.
and credit to
For the
Betty
period of December 13th through
to
December
December 30.
30th, and credit Betty for that same period of time.
Gosh, this is confusing.
It won't
Travis,
be
I was gonna say the same
if you work your way through it. Now, one thing you may need to do is give yourself a visual here. You may need to go, okay, Betty's over here, Tia's over here, right? You may need to do that because Betty is selling the property to Tia, and then your closing is way here.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And then you may need to look at it and go, okay, well, the problem period of time is here. Let me change my highlighter color. This is the problem. Because Betty paid for that period of time and she shouldn't have paid for it. Isn't that visually the same thing we're saying down at the bottom?
Yes.
Yes,
I like
but
the
in the
visual
previous
better.
one, in the previous one, Travis, didn't you say the opposite? In the previous example, from September, I think it was, didn't you say January 1 through September 30th or something like that?
I did.
So I guess that's why I'm getting confused.
Because you're
if we're
trying
saying
to
the
memorize something and it doesn't work that way. You can't memorize when it comes to prorations. You have to think about making it right. And every situation is going to be different. In
Is
the
it co-
previous one, here's
The buyer.
Here's the problem. I'm going to draw the timeline and we're going to talk about it. Okay. So here's the timeline here. Who is the seller in this thing?
Thomas.
Thomas, right? Okay. Who is the buyer? Sheila, right?
Sheila. Mhm.
Okay. So let's just circle the person getting screwed. It says Thomas is selling his home to Sheila and the closing is scheduled for September 30th, 2022. Thomas has not yet paid the property tax bill for the year and the bill will be paid in full by Sheila. So can we circle Sheila saying she's the one getting screwed? Does that make sense?
Yes. Correct.
Which means she's going to get a what? Credit. Everybody with me on that?
Yes.
And that means Thomas is going to get a what?
A bill, a debit.
A debit. Not a bill.
Sorry.
Not a bill, a debit. Okay. Sheila's going to get a credit. Thomas is going to get a debit. It says the closing is right here, September 30th. Now, Sheila paid for the whole year, the whole timeline, correct?
Okay.
Correct.
Mhm. Yeah.
Now, highlight the period of time that Sheila is getting screwed for, not the period of time that she should have paid for. We're not
Gotcha.
worried about that. We're worried about the mistake. What's the mistake? Sheila should not have paid for this right here. Who
Right.
should have paid for that?
Thomas.
Thomas. Well, we're going to fix it right now because guess what we're going to do? We're going to charge or debit Thomas for that portion of the year. And who are we going to give the money to?
Sheila.
To Sheila because she paid for the whole thing.
Okay.
So Thomas needs to use his debit card to pay Sheila.
That's exactly right. And she's going to have a credit in her account because he paid her. If you want to use that terminology. Does that help, Taj?
Yes. That makes a lot more sense. Okay.
And so on this one, when you look at it, the only thing I didn't do here was circle the person, quote unquote, getting screwed. It says Betty selling her home to Tia with the closing schedule for December 12th. Betty has paid the property tax bill in full prior to closing. So can we agree that Betty's the one getting screwed over here?
Yes.
Does that make sense for everybody?
Yes. Yes.
Betty's the one getting screwed over, which means she's the one getting the credit, which means Tia's the one getting the what?
Debit.
The debit. Okay. So highlight the period of time that Betty should not have paid for. Well, that's Tia's part of the year. Does that make sense for everybody?
Yes.
Yeah.
And that's why it's from December 13th through the 30th. Okay? So now I want y'all to do this one. If you draw it out yourself, if you need to, make a visual. And really all I'm interested in is the answer down at the bottom. Use the chart as much as you need to help yourself, but realistically, what the answer is down there at the bottom. Sorry. How many of you have that?
Yes.
How many of you got debit buyer, credit seller, and the period of time is from June 19th through December 30th?
Yep, that's what I got.
Yep.
If you got that, folks, you're going to get your proration questions right because the math is easy. The hard part is getting the debits and credits straight. The math part is a cinch. It really is. If you can get the debits and credits straight. Okay. We got a couple more to practice because it takes practice with these. Okay. Tanya selling her rental property on February 10th with buyer Bill purchasing what will be his first investment property. The tenant will remain in the property and has paid rent for the month of February in advance of the closing. Okay. How many came up with this? Debit Tanya for February the 11th through February the 30th. Credit Bill for the same period of time.
Yes.
Yep, got that.
When you get to the point that you can.
I got the dates wrong.
What date? How'd you get the dates wrong?
David and Tanya from February 1st to February 10th because they paid the rent for the month of February.
Correct. Why did you take rent from Tanya for the period of time that she owned the property? You didn't fix the situation. You made it worse. You took the wrong amount of rent from her.
Okay, drawing a blank. Okay, so Tanya paid, Tanya already received all the money.
So she got all, so we need to take money from her. You got that part right.
Okay.
Okay. Do we take rent from her for her own ownership, or should we take rent from her for the last part of the month when she didn't own the property?
Got
Just
it.
for the
February
first.
10th to February 30th.
Right. The problem part is the end of the month here. Okay.
Mhm.
And
How
that's
many of these are there gonna be?
about 6 dozen. No, here's the thing. Of the 10 math questions on the test, probably 2 or 3 of them center around prorations. So it's a big chunk of the math. Here's the great thing though. They're not really math questions. They're logic questions, right? So when people tell me they hate math, I'm like, well, you can get 2 or 3 of them right without doing any math, because these proration questions are all going to be about. Here's the interesting thing. There might only be one answer choice on there that says debit Tanya, credit Bill. If there's only one answer choice that says debit Tanya, credit Bill, do you even need to do any math?
We don't have to.
You don't have to. You know that's got to be the answer. Does that make sense for everybody?
Mhm.
That's why this part of it is so important. So I want you to go ahead and do this one on your own. I know we've seen it before. There's 2 more here, and I want you to do them both. Okay. So that I make sure you got this on lockdown. How the debits and credits work, because I just cannot over stress how important that part of it is. And try to ignore that we have a really obnoxious seller in this transaction. I mean, I know that's tough to ignore, but do your best.
Sorry, I'm talking about.
How we feel? Debit Seth, credit Benny, January 1 through April 10th.
Yes.
That's how you do them. That's how you do them, folks. Okay? And the more you get in the groove, the more you start to see. You can literally just see it. You can see those pieces turning. You're like, oh, that's wrong. Let me fix that. It's like, I mean, it really is. You're spotting injustice and fixing it. You know, let me offset this. Okay. Not April 11th. First of all, it wouldn't be April 11th through April 30th, because this is property taxes. Remember, you got to pay attention to what you're prorating. That's going to be the full year. So even if you did April 11th, it should have been April 11th through December 30th, but that was the wrong part of the year. We don't want to give Benny credit for his own portion of the year. He owes for that. We want to give him credit for the portion that he paid that he didn't owe for. Think about what's wrong and make it right. Benny paid for January through April. He should not have. So give him a credit for that. Okay. All right. Look at this one. Zola owns an apartment complex located in downtown Durham, is contracted to sell the complex to Bosco. Settlement scheduled for March 10th. How should the debit and credit be handled on the disclosure statement? Oops. Back up. Debit Zelda, credit Bosco, January 1 through March 10. If you got that, folks, you really have got this whipped. I mean, we're about to add the math to it, but you'll be shocked how easy the math is now that you understand this part, because this is the part that throws people off about prorations. It's not the math, it's this part. It's getting the debits and credits straight. We okay to move on?
Yep.
Feel pretty good there? Yeah.
So just to make sure I'm thinking of this correctly, when you do the dates, it's always what you're crediting. Is that the way you're thinking of it?
When you what? No, there are no
Always
always,
what you're,
there's no always rules in prorating.
okay,
You can't do that. You can't, because rent's going to throw you for a loop when you do that. Remember, rent reverses the gears, right? You have to literally sit there and think which part of the period is the problem, which is the problem part. That's the part I need to deal with. And in this case, the problem part is the first part of the year. Bosco should have never paid for the first part of the year. So that's the part we have to deal with.
okay.
Okay. There we go. Look at Russell. I just noticed that. Russell, I don't know if you're still in Hollister, but I'm gonna come down there and pat you on the back for that answer. If that's where I think you mentioned you were from Hollister. But that's awesome. That is a great conclusion. Russell said in the chat, so every transaction before September, debit the seller for property taxes. Right? We know that's true because the property taxes are never going to have been what?
Paid.
Paid before September, because the bill has never gone out before September. Does that make sense for everybody?
Yep.
Okay. But that's the kind of thing that if I said it in the beginning, it would be in one ear and out the other, because until you really understand the why it works that way, why these debits and credits work the way they do, you can't understand a statement like that. So the fact that you get that does. So now let's look at doing one with the math all the way through. Okay, we want to go all the way through. It says Tom is purchasing a home in Chapel Hill and closing is scheduled to take place on May 12th of 2021. The previous year's tax bill of $9,840 will be used to estimate the property taxes for the purpose of closing. Okay. Based on this information, what's the correct entry in the closing disclosure statement for the property tax proration? Okay, so now they've actually added a number here. But before we get to the numbers, does it make sense that we want to go ahead and get the time right, the debits and credits right before we even deal with the numbers?
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
So let's walk through this. Who do we think is getting screwed here based on what we know so far?
Tom.
What do y'all think? Tom?
Tom.
Yeah.
Mhm.
I
The
agree.
buyer.
The buyer. That's right. Tom, the buyer. Okay. So does it make sense then that that's going to be credit, seller,
Debit buyer.
buyer? Everybody okay with that?
Mm-hmm.
Hopefully that's coming faster for you now. Does that? If it does not make sense, speak up about why that does not make sense, because I want to help you with it.
I'm struggling right now.
All right. So why are you struggling? Talk to me.
If Tom is getting screwed, wouldn't he be the credit? Sorry. If Tom is getting screwed, wouldn't he get credit for it?
Oh yeah. I'm sorry. You're right.
Yeah, I was confused. Yeah.
Yeah, I was confused too.
You're not confused. I'm wrong. I wrote it down wrong. Credit,
Okay.
Tom. Thank you. That's why I asked.
Thank you, Taj. I was going wacko there.
There you go. No, y'all weren't. Speak up. I do it sometimes too. There we go. And Molly said it in the chat. Okay. So credit, Tom, debit the seller. Everybody good with that? I like that better too. That's why we got to talk through them. Sorry. Thank you, Tosh. All right. Same question.
What period of time are we debiting the seller for?
Well, so that's what the next screen deals with.
Okay, sorry.
So we're debiting who here?
Tom.
Tom, the seller, the seller,
No,
right?
the
We're
seller,
debiting
yeah.
The seller.
credit Tom. Okay, debit the seller, credit Tom, the buyer. Everybody good with that? Okay. Now, let's talk about the period of time that's the problem. Is the red period of time the problem on the timeline below, or is the green period of time the problem? Which period of time did Tom pay for that he should not have paid for?
The
The
red.
red.
First,
Very first
red
May
time.
12th.
The
Two.
red one. Does that make sense for everybody?
Mhm.
Yes.
Yes.
Tanya,
So-
say that one more time.
I said, which period of time did Tom pay for that he should not have paid for? Which one is the problem period of time? Think of it as, again, you're trying to find the mistake in the real world. Tom paid for the whole year. He either was supposed to pay for only the red or only the green, but he's now paid for both. Which one was wrong? Which one should he not have paid for? Tom is the buyer. Which one should he have not paid for?
Oh, January 1 to May
January
12.
1 to May
Yes.
The
12.
red one. And so that's the period of
Before
time.
he owns the property.
That's the period of time we need to fix. Does that make sense for everybody?
Mhm.
Okay.
Yes.
So this is going to be from January 1 through May 12th. January 1 to May 12th. Everybody good with that?
Right.
Mhm.
Don't we credit Tom to the 13th?
No. Same
Okay.
period of time. Remember that. Exactly the same on both sides. Same number, same period of time. Don't change it. Exactly the same. Okay. So now we use the number they gave us to figure out an amount for that. Now we're ready to do math. We've got the debits and credits figured out. Look at the period of time. Do we know what period of time we're working with? What y'all
Yes.
think? Yeah.
Yeah. Mhm.
We eliminate everything. Can we just do this mentally for ourselves now for the rest of this proration? Can we just go, this over here does not exist?
Yes.
Can we do that for this proration now?
Yes.
We
Mhm.
only care about the red period of time. We know we're debiting the seller. We know we're crediting the buyer. Does that make sense for everybody?
Uh-huh. Yeah.
Yes.
So let's do that. If we've got a $9,840 annual bill and we divide that by 360 days in the year,
27,33333.
yep, 27.33333 per day. Everybody okay with that number?
Uh-huh.
Now, what day we're starting on?
January 1st,
January 1 through what day?
May 12.
May 12th.
May 12th. Now we need to count days. January is 30, February is 30, March is 30,
132.
April is 30, and May is 12. 30, 60, 90, 120,
132.
132 days.
Uh-huh.
Yes.
We're just again, there's no thinking involved at this point because we're just counting the days that we already committed to this time period. Does that make
Mhm.
sense for everybody? We're not thinking at this point. We know we said January 1 through May 12th. We're just going to count the number of days there. Everybody following me?
Yes.
Yes.
We know that's 27.33333 per day. We got
And
132
132.
days. Looks to
Are we
me.
using, sorry,
No, go ahead.
hey, Mr. Charles, so we're using what we learned previously to get to this part?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay, I got lost. I got it now.
We're just adding the numbers in because saying debit the seller doesn't make any sense until you know how much money to debit the seller. But the money is actually the last part of the thing. Does everybody see that this is going to be the number we're going to deal with is $3,607.99? Is everybody okay with that number?
Yes.
Yes.
Where that number comes from? How many times are we going to put that number into a closing statement, folks?
Twice.
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 Twice. And it's going to be exactly the same number both times. Does everybody agree with that?
Yes.
Absolutely.
3607.99 or 3608 is fine because it's 0.9999. We'll just say 3608 twice. Debit who?
3609. That is fine.
Debit the seller.
Debit seller, credit buyer. Everybody see how we did that now?
Yep.
Notice that the math is the last part of doing this. The math is the absolute last piece, not the first. The temptation is you have with these things is to jump to math. You can't do the math until you have the debit and credit figured out. You can't do the math until you have the time period figured out. Only then, because here's the thing, remember, will that sometimes help you answer the question without ever even doing math? What do y'all think?
Yes.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
For sure it will.
Sometimes you don't even need to do the math, but hey, that's
Sometimes you don't
another
do the math.
topic.
Okay. So go ahead. I want y'all to do this one. There's a couple here that I want you to do. Okay. And I want to make sure you can do them. So I want you to take a minute here, and I'm just going to go ahead and put it on this screen because it's got the same text on it, but I think having the visual of the timeline is helpful there.
Please schedule to close.
Just give me a little time. Don't zip through this so fast, so I'll have time to figure it out, please.
Okay. Well, so here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to give you what's reasonable on the test. How about 4 minutes? That's a long time for a math question.
Okay, just give me a little time.
Don't shout out the answer either.
Okay. It's not been paid by the buyer, so the seller is being screwed.
We got it. All right, before you go any further, I'm just give you a pause look in. I'm not stopping you because I don't have anything close to a final answer. But I don't want you to go too far in the wrong direction. I want everybody to look and see if you have this proration, the one I have written on the screen. Do you have debit seller, credit buyer, January 1 through September 24th?
Yep.
Okay.
Yes.
Good. If you don't have that, you're heading the wrong direction. I don't want you to do math based on the wrong proration. If you have that, keep on going with the math. If you don't, I'll just hold off for the explanation at the end because there's no need for you to do math based on the wrong period of time.
Yay.
There's your final answer. Debit the seller for $2,830.67. Credit the buyer for the same $2,830.67. So now here's a question I have for anybody out there who did not get to that conclusion. I need to know if the problem is on the back end with the math calculation, or if the problem is on this part, the front end, with getting the debits and credits correct.
It was debits and credits for me.
Okay, so talk to me, Howard. Why did
I don't know. You go so fast. I'm having trouble just trying to keep up. So I wrote down that Tia at first was credited, and just go through it, and maybe I'll get it if you take a little time and go through it. But I had it just the opposite.
I'm gonna ask you to go through it. Who is paying the whole bill for the taxes? Buyer or seller?
The seller.
They are.
Okay, all right. Tia is scheduled to close on her new home September 24th. Tia is the buyer. The tax, okay, that's the tax bill, have not been paid yet. So in September.
Keep reading.
Huh?
Keep reading.
Okay, all right. The annual tax bill have not been paid yet, so we know that, and it will be paid later in the year by the buyer.
Stop.
All right. Okay.
So who's getting screwed? Who's paying the whole tax bill?
The buyer, right? The buyer.
Right. Exactly right. So who needs a credit?
The buyer.
Yeah,
Same answer.
I wrote down in my notes here, the buyer should get the credit, but I think you wrote down the buyer should get debited.
No, it's on the screen right there now. I got credit, buyer, debit, seller. You see that?
Yeah, okay.
Okay, so is that what you wrote down?
I wrote down credit originally, yeah.
No, you have to write down both. Credit who?
Wait a minute, hold a second. I'm getting confused. All right, buyer. Yeah, okay. I have what you have there. Yes.
Okay. And so now once you decide to credit the buyer, that means you should also write down debit who?
The seller. I wrote that down. Yes.
All right,
okay.
good. So you got that part. So that's not the problem. Okay.
All right.
So now, do you have January 1st through September 24th?
I do.
Then you were perfect here.
All right, but okay. Somehow I thought you had written down before just the opposite of what I had, and it just
I didn't change it.
Okay, all right.
I didn't change it. That's the same thing I wrote down. So you were right on the money. And then the second half of it is just as simple as saying, okay, well, if the tax bill is $38.60 per year, we're going to divide that by 360 days to get to $10.72 per day. Then we figure that's 264 days from January 1 through September 24th. And you really, however you need to come up with that, I usually will actually make note for myself and write it down. January is 30, February 30, March 30, April 30, May 30, June 30, July 30, August 30, and then September would be 24. Whatever method you use to come up with the number of days is fine.
Yeah, I see where I screwed up. In trying to keep up with your timeline and time here, I rushed and I got the incorrect amount of days.
Okay. So
just trying to rush through this.
What number of days do you have?
I got 174, and I just screwed up with my calculator or
All right.
something.
Well, then that's easy to fix. I mean, all that is a number of days. Okay. As
Yeah.
long as you got wrote down from January 1 through September 24th, and you got the debits and credits correct, debit seller, credit buyer, you're well on your way to answering the question. So it's not a matter of getting frustrated that you don't get a perfect answer. It's a matter of understanding I've got 90% of this nailed down. And that's why I'm trying to isolate where the issue is.
Yeah. All right.
Okay. Well, you
All
got
right,
another chance. Go for it. Seller Sal and buyer Betsy have agreed to a closing date of December 10th, 2021 for Sal's home in Governor's Club. The sales price of the house is $857,000, and the annual property tax bill of $7,650 has been paid in full by Sal prior to closing. What should be the correct prorated entry into the closing disclosure statement for each party? And I'm going to mute you all, mute myself, and I'm not going to say anything. We'll say 5 minutes. That's longer than you really need to take on one. I'll give you 5 minutes and see if you can do it. Full answer. All right, that's what 5 minutes feels like. Debit buyer, credit seller, $425. Debit buyer, credit seller, $425. So I saw some of you.
I need you to walk me through that one.
I saw some of you have the right answer. I see some of you are off by a day or so. So first of all, let's talk about the proration. Does everybody see here that the seller is the one getting screwed over? Everybody see that? Okay.
Yes.
So that means we've got the credit seller, debit buyer. Hopefully everybody got that part right. Did you get that far? Did you get to credit seller, debit buyer?
Yes.
If you got that part, remember you're halfway to answering the test question correctly. You have to remember you're going to be able to crack these test questions in phases here. Some of the answer choices, they're not going to have 4 answer choices that say debit, buyer, credit, seller. I can assure you of that. You're going to be able to eliminate at least 1 answer choice just with that part. Everybody good with that? Okay. Now, let's talk about the period of time. What's the mistake period of time? What period of time did the seller pay for that just ain't fair? Is it the period before closing or the period after closing?
After closing.
Period after closing is just not fair. Does that make sense for everybody?
Yes.
And so that's why it's December 11 through the 30th. So now talk to me. Those of you that had problems, is this where the problem is, or are we right so far here? Are we correct so far here?
This is where I was wrong at, but
Me too.
What do you have wrong here? What do you have
I
wrong?
did 19 days.
I don't. That's not here. That's not on this screen though.
Oh.
no, sorry, I did
No,
January.
that I got right.
Okay. Where are we wrong then? If we're wrong on this screen, I need to know where the problem is.
I put the incorrect answer because I just did February 10th, but I kind of understand it when you say you gotta pick up. It's not fair for them to pay after they already sold their own.
Right.
So now, and I think I messed up right here on this section because I actually did the 10th because it was stated on the page.
Now, here's why the 10th is wrong. Shouldn't they have paid for the 10th? They're the seller, right?
Right. Okay. I have to bring it back to what you said earlier this morning. You do not cut off utilities until closing has happened. So what makes you think that they're not going to pay the same day of closing for taxes?
Right. But here's the thing. I'm not nearly as concerned about the day of closing as y'all are. Y'all stress too much about the small stuff. Here's the way I'm looking at it. You either got from January to December on these lines, or you got December to December on these lines. Did you get December to December on this line?
Yes.
Yes.
Then you are 95% to answering this test question, because I can assure you one day is not going to make a difference.
Okay.
Did anybody put January to December here? That's what I'm concerned with.
I did, but that's what I was trying to get you to for December 11th through the 30th. But I think you're going into that explanation now. But I had January 1 to December 10th.
So talk to me then, TT. Why? Why did you think that was the unfair time period? Or are you just guessing? Are you flipping a coin? Because you need to admit to yourself that's what you're doing. If that's what you're
I
doing.
was doing so quick too, and I make the mistake, but because of retention.
Sorry, I just kept in my mind about the taxes.
Travis, I thought because the seller paid already from January 1 to December 10.
And they should have.
Get a credit from the buyer for that period of time. But
why? That's their period of time.
That's what they owe.
That's
TT,
right.
what do you mean by you were focusing on the taxes though?
Yeah, that's my question too. I'm not sure where I'm trying to help you, and I don't know where we're at.
I was getting confused with the last examples. When we with us and Russell, when Russell gave that analogy to help us better understand it, I took that into this problem is what I was saying, but I have it now. Which y'all saying that they should only pay on what they're owed now.
That's it. That's exactly right. We're trying to make it fair. Here's the way you have to look at it. One person paid for the whole year, right? One person paid for the whole year. It's not fair that one person paid for the whole year. We need to figure out what part of the year they should not have paid for and give them a credit for that part. Does that make sense for everybody? So the one person that paid for the whole year is the seller. So give them a credit. We need to give them a credit for the unfair part of the year. Don't give them a credit for the fair part. Give them a credit for the unfair part. Which part of the year was a screwing over? Which part of the year was unfair?
And then the year from December 11 to
End of the
December 5th.
year, because the seller did not own the property. Does that help, TT? You're always looking for the unfair part of the time period. Elizabeth, you okay with that?
Okay,
just
well,
wanna
I
go
was just
this-
looking
go
for
ahead.
Russell's hint, that because that helped me about before they're
Well,
due.
here's the thing. It doesn't help you. It doesn't. You think it
No.
does. It
No, no, no,
only
no.
helps you if you understand my way first. The reason it helps Russell is because he worked his way there logically. You're trying to memorize what Russell said, which is a great contribution, and I'm not downplaying it. Memorization doesn't work when it comes to prorations. You have to logic your way to the answer. Then you can understand, oh, I see a trend. That's different. That's different. You
I want to
can't
throw this out there while you're
you cannot say before this is always going to be that way, but after this is going to always be that way, and expect it's going to work for you. It won't.
right. Just because the bill has been established for the year or the amount hasn't been established for the year isn't going to tell you who owes what. The seller is always going to owe. Listen to me. Heed my words. The seller is always going to owe January 1st to the day of closing, whether they've paid it or not. The buyer is going to always owe the day after closing till December 30th, whether they've paid or not.
Exactly. And what we're trying to do is find which party got stuck with the whole thing and then reimburse them for the unfair portion. That's the goal of the proration.
Okay.
And that's why I'm telling you, you think these are math questions. These are not. These are logic questions masquerading as math questions.
Well, that's probably the problem with me.
But I mean, that's what I'm saying though. People say, I can't get the math. I can't get the math. Did anybody struggle getting 21, 25 a day? No. Did anybody struggle multiplying that times the number of days? Even if you came up with 19 days versus 20, did anybody struggle with? So can we agree that the math is the easy part of this?
Yeah, absolutely.
These are not
Agreed.
math questions, folks. They have numbers in them, but they're not math questions. They're logic questions. And the sooner you stop thinking about them as math questions, honestly, the better chance you'll have an answer in them. You really will. You really
Travis,
will.
I think the best way that it helps me think about the question is reversing the question as if it's me being asked for. So for example, if it were to say, just thinking about, well, if it's asking, well, yeah, how much would I owe? Or if I was a seller, like, if I already paid for the whole year, then the
You're
buyer,
you're putting yourself in the shoes of the buyer and the seller. Exactly.
exactly.
You're saying, and I think that's a great way to think about it. Because what Amy's essentially saying, or at least what I hear, I think she's saying, she's reading that and she's like, I'm the seller here. I paid for the whole year. What's fair to me? How do I make this fair to me? You need to reimburse me for the end of the year. I did not owe that and I paid it. And so you need to reimburse.
Whatever works for you to put yourself in here. And Travis, would it also help to maybe if they start claiming like, all right, I'm going to be the seller in every type of these situations. How do I need to make it fair for all sides?
Well, you can do that too.
If that works, then that works.
Now, I'm going to focus on those of you who are hung up on the number of days, because I know that's frustrating if you got all that far and you still got the wrong answer. By the way, you would still be right on the test. Just choose the one that's closest to your answer. That one day is not going to make you miss the question.
Right. They're never going to be that close.
If you got the wrong number of days, let me tell you why. You're being lazy. Counting the buyer's side is being lazy. I don't care that the closing is, you should only count the buyer's days for the one thing that you have no choice but to count the buyer. What's the one oddball thing that you have no choice but to count buyer days for? And we've already talked about how batshit weird it is.
How much?
Interim interest. Interim interest. Isn't that the one that screws with us on days every time?
Every time.
And the reason it screws with us on days is because you're counting buyer days. Don't count buyer days. Count seller days. I don't care if you need the buyer's days, count the sellers. The buyer owes the rest. Does that make sense for everybody?
Yeah.
Yep.
I get it. It's more work to count it, but it's easier to count the seller days because y'all tell the truth. If you had counted seller days, would you have gone all the way up through December 10th? If you had counted seller days, tell the truth, wouldn't you have come up with 340?
Yep.
And if you came up with 340, what number would you have been left with for the buyer?
20.
20. It takes the thinking out of it, folks. Don't count days for the buyer if you don't have to.
Okay.
Okay? Sorry to your eardrums.
It's all right. I'm just messing.
But it has to rattle in there, right? Because this is too much work for silly things to make you miss it. Does that make sense for everybody?
This should be one that you all get right.
Right? You should.
Without a shadow of a doubt.
There's one that that you said, Seth, that I just want to make sure I understood correctly. That the seller always pays from January 1st till the day of closing.
Yes.
What
they owe for it. What he said was they owe for it whether they've paid it or not.
Okay.
They may have paid it, they may not have paid it, but they owe
That
for
should
it.
help you discover your time periods.
Yeah, right. So if they owe it, then I just got to figure out.
Did they pay it?
Yeah, did they already pay it?
Debit or credit?
Did they pay it? That's exactly right.
Because debit or credit.
Whichever party paid not only for theirs, they paid for the other person too. You know?
Yes, this is always going to be, and Travis, that's such a good point. I'm sorry to interrupt you. It's always going to be a yearly bill. They're like Travis said, these people, we're not important to the government to send out a bill and say, hey, here's your portion. No, it's a full bill that somebody's got to take on and somebody else needs to pay their half.
Yep. So
prorations.
Prorating rent prorations could happen whenever the property is tenant occupied. Here, this is the one time you're allowed to memorize something. I'd prefer you not memorize it because I'd prefer you logic your way through the debits and credits always. But here's why rent is always going to be one way. Rent always works the same way. Rent is always paid when?
In advance.
For the month.
Advance at the first of the month, right? So when we get to a closing, who already has the rent for the month every single time?
The seller.
Seller does. Okay. So since the money is in the same place every time, does it make sense that the proration for rent is always going to be the same proration?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh.
Who is getting screwed on rent at
Buyer.
every closing?
The buyer.
Buyer. Anytime a property is tenant occupied, the buyer's getting screwed for rent. Does that make sense for everybody?
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
So that means credit buyer every time. Is everybody with me on that for rent?
Yeah.
Hear you loud and clear.
Means debit seller every time for rent. And the only reason that's an always rule is because rent always works the same way. Property tax bills, HOA dues, that depends on whether they've been paid or not. But rent has always been paid as of the day of closing. Does that make sense for everybody?
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Even when it hasn't
Even
been,
on the first.
even when it hasn't been, we treat it like it has. We literally say to the seller, that's your fault that you didn't collect the rent. We're going to treat it like you did for this closing.
Okay.
Does that
Makes
make
sense.
sense for everybody?
Yeah.
Okay. So when we prorate rent, that's always going to be a credit to the buyer, debit to the seller. Now, let me ask you this, though, about the rent proration. When you talk about prorating rent, we know that it's always the buyer that's getting screwed, right? It says a rental property is being sold on July 18th of 2022. and the monthly rent of $1,800 has been collected in advance by the seller. Based on this information, what's the correct entry into the closing disclosure statement for the rent portion? So does everybody agree that the buyer's getting screwed out of some rent here?
Come on. Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so that means credit who?
Credit buyer.
Buyer and debit seller.
Debit seller.
You got it.
Everybody okay with that part of it?
Yes.
I hope so.
Right? Remember, that's at least half the battle, if not more than that, just getting the flow of the money right. Now, let's talk about the period of time. We said we were going to debit seller. I'll go ahead and fill that in. Credit buyer. Let's talk about the period of time that's the problem here. Here's our closing in the middle of the month. We got seller over here.
And
We
buyer.
got buyer over here. Okay,
And
timeline
here.
always works the same. What period of time is the mistake? The seller got, let's talk about what happened already. Seller got all the money. Is everybody with me on that? Should the seller have gotten all the money?
No, just for the
No.
period.
They should have only gotten money for
July 1st to July 18th.
Yep, I'm gonna do some color here just so we can see. Should
Come
the
on, y'all.
seller
This
have gotten
isn't
money?
benefiting us.
Should the seller have gotten money for the green or for the orange? Which one should they have gotten money for?
The green.
For the green.
July 19th.
They got money for all of it. Does that make sense for everybody?
Yes.
Which one is the problem? Which one do we need
Yellow.
to fix?
The yellow. July 19th to the 30th.
July 19th to the 30th.
Does everybody see how we choose the time period?
Yep.
That's the one that's wrong. The seller should not have gotten that money. We already know whether it's a debit or credit. We already did that. But this time period over here was handled wrong. The seller should have never gotten that money, so we have to fix that time period. Is everybody okay with that statement?
Yep.
So this proration is going to be from July 19th through July 30th, right? July 19th through July 30th. So now, this is where I test you. Okay, monthly rent we said was $1,800. If we do that per day, $60 a day. Everybody okay with that number?
Yep.
Yep.
Okay.
How much is it?
$60 a day. Everybody all right with that number? Now, we said from July 19th through July 30th. I think I yelled something a little bit earlier. Never count whose days.
Sellers.
Buyers.
Don't
Just
ever start counting in the middle of a month if you can help it. Count the sellers, and then that'll give you the other side. How many days are there from the 1st through the 19th?
19.
19. How many days are there in the month?
30.
How many
11.
days does that leave for our proration?
11.
11.
11 days. Now, for those of you that prefer fingers and toes, you can do that too. You can literally go. You can go 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, and you will come up with the same number of days. Does that make sense for everybody?
Yep.
Okay. Oh, I'm sorry. We did it wrong. It's the closing's the 18th. I wrote down, I'm looking at what I wrote.
12 days.
It's 12. Thank you. Sorry. Because the closing's
I had that.
good for you.
Okay.
I had 12 too. I was confused.
It's because it's the closing date. How many days does the seller have? Is 18 days. The seller has 18 days, so the buyer has the other 12. I looked at my own writing from the 19th and thought that was the closing date. 12 days. But again, one day is not going to make a difference here. I'm going to tell you what's going to make a difference. Do you have the front half of the month or do you have the last half of the month? That's what's going to make a difference. The answers are not going to be close to each other. Is everybody with me on that? Okay. So if we're looking at 12 days at 60 days, $60 a day,
720.
$720. And we already decided that that was 720 that we are doing.
Credit to the buyer,
Credit buyer,
debit seller.
debit seller. Credit buyer, debit seller.
Are there
Hey.
any like this that they just leave it as is? Like you never get your money back if you don't follow up. And I'm just asking as a renter.
If that happens, then if there were real estate brokers involved in the transaction, they could be disciplined, because remember, what's one of our jobs? To verify the accuracy of the closing statement. This would be one
Everything
of those.
that you know.
Right. And so this would easily be something we should be aware of to verify on the closing statement.
Absolutely. This is the part when I say sorry. Something happened. But when I see problems like this for rent, A, B, C, and D, I am crossing out any answers that say credit the seller.
That's it. And I guarantee you, here's the interesting thing. Y'all want to know really how easy this question is going to be to answer on the test? You really want to know how easy this is going to be?
Yes.
I'll show you why.
Predators
Here's what the answer choices are going to look like on the test. Okay? And I know it because I've seen them 1,000 times. This is exactly what the answer choices are going to look like on the test. I can take some of the stress off of you. And they're going to have an answer choice that looks like this. Debit, buyer, credit seller, 1080. Then they're going to have one that says credit, buyer, 720, credit, seller, 1080. And then they're going to have one that says debit seller for 1080, credit buyer, 1080. And then the fourth one is going to be debit seller, 720, credit buyer, 720. So let's talk about those answer choices. Are there two of them you can eliminate right away without even thinking about the numbers?
Yes, A and B.
Yeah.
A and B. B, you could eliminate without even thinking about the question.
Because it's credit.
Because it's credit. Does that make sense for everybody now? Why that just goes away. Everybody with me?
Not only is it credit, it's different numbers.
Right. It's different numbers. It's credit. It's just wrong in 15 different ways. Does everybody see that one is gone? Is everybody good with that?
Yeah.
Yes.
Now, can we eliminate number one just based on the first thing we did of who's getting screwed, who's getting the debit, and who's getting the credit? Does that make sense for everybody? So before we even looked at numbers, are we down to a 50-50 shot of answering the question without doing any math?
Yeah.
You want to see how you didn't have to do any math at all? Once you decided on the time period, folks, were we working with less than half of the month or more than half of the month? The time period we were working with?
Less than.
Less than half, right? July 19th through the 30th. Isn't that less than half of the month?
Yes.
Find
like
the
3
answer
days.
that has your debits and credits right and has the smaller number.
Yeah.
You literally never have to touch a calculator to do that question. You literally never have to touch a calculator to do that question, because that's how they're going to set it up. They're going to give you the two numbers for the proration and expect you to know which side to choose. Does that make sense for everybody?
Absolutely. These numbers, when you get down to 1080 and 720, those are going to be numbers that one of the sides owe.
That's right.
They're not going to give you a number that does not belong to either one of the sides.
On a question like this, they're not going to give you a fake number. The numbers they put up there will either be the buyer's numbers or the seller's numbers, and they're just going to mix and match them. And they just expect you to pick which one that's right. You can do that without doing any math.
Did they just pull the 1080 out of the air?
No, it's the other. It's 1080 plus 720 is 1800. That's the 2% combined. That's the other number. That's the other half of it.
And I say it that way just because like these numbers will add up to your monthly or whatever proration
If
you
you were
are.
prorating more than half the month, you would have chosen the what?
1080.
The 1080, the bigger number, right? But I mean, literally, logically. So, folks, if they give you a property tax proration, let me give you a quick question. Watch this. Okay, watch this. Closings today. Property taxes have been paid. That's all the information I'm giving you. Closing today, property taxes paid. Everybody good with me?
That's them.
Now, who we crediting?
Seller.
Selling.
Seller.
Seller.
Everybody good with that?
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Who we debiting?
Buyer.
Buyer.
Buyer. What period of time are we working with? Are we working with the period of time before closing or the period of time after closing? If we're crediting the seller, debiting the buyer, are we working with the period of time after or before?
After.
After.
After. More than half the year or less than half the year?
Less than half.
So what you're looking for is the one answer choice, and I guarantee you there will only be one that says debit buyer, credit seller, little number that matches. That'd be the only answer choice that has that.
Little number than the two that you've narrowed it down to.
That would be the only one.
And that's because we're prorating from closer to the end of the month, right?
Closer to
That's
the
why,
end.
that's why it's the little number.
That's right. That's exactly right. We're prorating the smaller part of the year, so it's going to be the smaller number.
This is where your timeline comes into play.
Those taxes is whole year, no monthly.
Right.
Mhm.
I told you, like I said from the beginning, and I think it starts to sink in the more and more we do them. These are not really math questions. They are logic questions that put on the mask of a math question. You know, do you understand the basics of which way is the money flowing? That will answer, that will eliminate at least half the answer choices right there. And then are you using the small, do the numbers match? That's another thing to test for. Make sure you eliminate choices where the numbers don't match. So you need a debit, you need to eliminate double debits, eliminate double credits, eliminate any where the numbers don't match, eliminate any where the money's not flowing the right way. I had somebody who came out of the test, she told me last week, she said I had 2 proration questions and I didn't do math on either one of them. She said on both of them, there was only one where it was debiting the right person and crediting the right person. I didn't even care what the numbers said. It was the only one that said debit, credit, buyer, seller. And I said, well, there you go. There you go. Getting the money headed in the right direction is 90% of the battle when it comes to prorations. Okay, so don't miss those.
I have a question.
Yes.
This is not about the proration. You had mentioned when you were helping someone earlier that you would give us 4 minutes to do a question. Is it time on the exam? You know, are we going to be looking at a question and then let's say we exceed our time and we don't?
No, each individual question is not time, but you should never spend more than 4 or 5 minutes on a single question because remember you got 140 of them to answer in 4 hours. That works out to a little bit less than 2 minutes per question. If you're taking 4 minutes on math questions, that means you got to be taking less than a minute on a lot of other questions to make up that time. So do not sit there and agonize over if you know that you are slow with math questions, skip them, bookmark them, and come back to them at the end. I'd rather you guess 10 math questions than guess 30 theory questions because you ran out of time because you got mired down in the math. You know, that's just time management.
Okay.
You know, so, you know, math obviously is always going to take a little bit more time, but I think still on the, 4 minutes is on the long end of what you need to be spending on any question, even a math question, really.